Welcome back to another magazine flick through. So we're looking at Edge again for July 1994. It's been a little while since I've done one of these, so I'm looking forward to getting back into doing them a little bit more regularly. So what have we got this month? It's about 3D really. Really looking at 3DO, and this issue really is about moving on from CD-ROM FMV games to being something more like the PlayStation and the Saturn and the arcades that were really around at the time. So the question is, what's happening with the 3DO? Well, we knew eventually, didn't we? But at this point, I don't think anyone really knew. Ridge Racer. That might be a hint. But, so what have we got this month? We've got interview with Trip Hawkins on the 3DO. Jeff Minter. Looking forward to reading that. Out of Sync, talking about different standards, UK, Japan and America. So, I mean, we all know about 50 Hz, 60 Hz now, but I wonder if a lot of people didn't really understand the difference. Perhaps if you didn't import games, you wouldn't really know any better. Nintendo 32-bit machine for 95. So this is the Ultra 64 that then became the N64. Which was flagged as a 64-bit machine by Nintendo. I suppose that was the thing, wasn't it? The bit wars. Yeah, so they're talking about a commitment. We haven't seen from any other publisher, so that's Dave Jones' DMA Design. I'm trying to think what games came out by DMA. There was, I think it was called Body Harvest, which was like a free-roaming sort of tank game. Anyway, I've never played it, but I've heard good things about it. But sadly, no GTA. So Sega's leading with 32-bit. So they're pushing... Now, was this just before the 32X came out? I forget exactly when it came out. But they're talking about Mars systems and Saturn. So Mars was the code name for the 32X before it came out. So this was difficult for a point for a consumer because you've got all these machines like the 32X, you've got Mega CD as well, you've got the CDI, you've got the Jaguar, you've got the 3DO, Amiga CD32, and there was just so much choice around at the time. And I think a lot of people didn't really know, what to buy. And I think if you were a Sega fan, the Saturn was just around the corner, and I think that seemed like a much better bet. And that's really what happened. It sold reasonably well at launch, but the PlayStation, the N64 eventually dominated. Yeah. So they're saying the Mars or the Mega Drive 32 will sit on top of the machine rather than power-based converter. Yeah. So they're saying it works with the Mega CD too. It does. There aren't that many games. There's a few conversions of the digital pictures games like Night Trap that have a better colour depth. But that's it really. They're essentially saying that it's like the 32X is going to be a bit like the SVP Super FX, but instead of buying expensive cartridges, you just buy one add-on. I wonder if they'd have been better just making more games like Virtual Racing in the end. I'm just hoping that the price of those chips came down, but I understand why. But yeah, so they're saying that it's got two SH2s, a bit like the Saturn really, although the Saturn's got more hardware, and it's just £150 they're saying. Now in today's money, is that more like 200 quid? But yeah, it was still quite expensive for what it was really. Jaguar gets booted up. So yeah, the Jaguar came out this time. I remember this was the one that I went for, partially because I saw an episode of Games Master that had Alien vs Predator, and I really, really wanted to play that game. I was going to get a 32X originally. That was really before I'd seen Daytona. I think if I'd seen that first, I'd have held it on, until the Saturn. But the Jaguar, I remember, was a lot cheaper than the other machines at the time. Probably because it didn't have a CD drive. Yeah, so they reckon that the Jaguar will attract more than 10 million users. I don't think that really happened, sadly. Argonaut. Yeah, Argonaut was, they were a British company, and they developed a few 3D games. They did Star Glider 2, the first one as well. And they did a few games on the Game Boy that were in colour, 3D, sorry. And eventually they ended up being commissioned to develop the Super FX chip for Nintendo with Star Fox. And I think these guys really did a good job of using low power hardware for doing pretty good 3D. Like vector-based 3D, really not a lot of texture mapping on these early machines. But yeah, so they're talking here about complex rotation, sprite scaling, deformation effects. But what machine are they talking about? So it would be Super FX. Yeah, so they're saying that Argonaut claimed that the system can move more than 65,000 polygons per second, so divide that by 30 or 60 depending on your frame rate to get polygons per frame. A resolution of 320 200 on a 66 MHz 486. Yeah, so they're really talking about where we're going now with these new machines. So the PC and the PlayStation and the Saturn. But yeah, 3D really was a big deal then, and it really set the framework for where we are now. Commodore up for grabs. Yeah, this was when Commodore sadly went out of business at the end of '94. So I think they could see here that Commodore was struggling, and the CD32 didn't really sell as many as perhaps Commodore would have liked. It was really just an Amiga 1200 in a console with a CD drive, and it was great because you get conversions of a lot of really good Amiga games, but I think a lot of people that wanted to play those games would have already had an Amiga, and there wasn't really much point if you had one, or even an Amiga 500. There's little incentive to spend a lot of money on this new machine. Surfing in on the silver disc. So this looks like a publisher, CD-ROM. Don't remember these guys. They probably did a lot of like streaming video. So they're talking about Rebel Assault. Maybe they were a technology developer that did a lot of the, the underlying middleware technology. Not sure. Yeah, definitely F&V all the way, isn't it? Super Street Fighter 2. Yeah, it's nice to see at this point Edge is covering a lot of these new machines that often weren't really in the home, or perhaps weren't in a lot of people's homes. So it's good to see that there's still coverage on the Mega Drive and the SNES, the current formats. NEC's new 32-bit FX system. Yeah, sadly we never really got that. There were a few really Japanese F&V games, but not really that much came out on it. It wasn't backwards compatible with the PC Engine, which was a bit of a shame. Yeah, with the 3DO and the Jaguar here, is the Saturn worth waiting for? Yep, I think it is. Archer McLean. I'm trying to think what he was doing at the time. Jimmy White 1 had come out, and Jimmy White 2 was a few years away. I'm sure I discussed this in one of the previous issues, but I've forgotten. It's been a few months since I've looked at earlier issues for 94. So pre-screen. Yeah, it's interesting to look at some of these screenshots, and you can't really tell what the game is. I think with 16-bit games you could look at it immediately and go, okay, that's a platformer, or that's a shoot 'em up, or a sports game, or whatever. But with some of these, you look at them and you go, how does that actually play? So this is Jurassic Park. Like, this almost looks like an FPS style game, but I don't know if it's one of those mixtures like the SNES game where you had some sections that were FPS, some sections that were top down. But it looks like this has got a lot of video sequences in it. I suppose a little bit like the Mega CD game in a way. There were a lot of versions of that game that were all totally different. Dr. Hauser 3DO. This looks like Alone in the Dark. I don't know very much about this, but it looks like, very similar. You've got a static image on the background, and then you've got these polygonal elements. It looks like there's a bit of texture mapping on his hair, so it could be a little bit of a step up from Alone in the Dark visually. Don't know much about it. I mean, essentially, it looks pretty similar. Incoming. I remember this on the PC. But I'm sure this was a 3D game. With this, you can't really tell because it's just lots of pre-rendered visuals. But I remember this being, you were in a cockpit and you were shooting in 3D. So I don't know, maybe the gameplay wasn't really developed at that point. Origin Systems. This Journeyman Project, and this was System Shock. System Shock's an absolute classic game. The sequel, I think, is my favourite of those two games, but there's a remake of the original coming out, so I'm looking forward to playing that soon. Yeah, so they're talking about dramatic camera angles. Now, what is that for? They're talking about System Shock at this point. Hard to say, really. But it's nice to see on the PC that they're trying to do different things. Like, the term that got bandied around a lot was Doom clone. And I think that was perhaps a little bit unfair, and I think it started with games like Hexen, well, maybe less Hexen, more Heretic, that were really... They were really using the Doom engine, and it was like a reskin with different graphics, but the gameplay was essentially the same. And you've got games from Apogee, or Apogee, and 3D Realms, and I think some games like Duke Nukem 3D did do something a bit different, but System Shock tried to put more of an RPG spin on it, and the atmosphere in that game is fantastic. It's I think the crudeness of some of the graphics that add to the horror atmosphere a little bit. It leaves a bit more to the imagination, but I mean, that's just me. I like that. I do like that style. I think sometimes the more detail you put in, you slightly take away from the experience a little bit. But we'll see how this remake turns out. SimCity Enhanced CD-ROM. This looks like the first one. There's a load of versions of SimCity and SimCity 2000. Every time CD technology came out or a new version of Windows came out, there was a new version for it, and they were all subtly different. NEC. Yeah, this is Strider on the PC Engine CD. Now, looking at this, the screenshot's a little blurry here, but looking at it, I think the colour palette is better than the Mega Drive version, but the gameplay's not meant to be as good. It's not seen in such a high regard as the Mega Drive game. But talking about the PlayStation, there's a good sequel to this that came out on the PlayStation 1 quite near the end of its life. It did come out in PAL territories as well. That's worth picking up. I don't remember if that has the original game on it or not. But Strider 2 that came out on the PlayStation isn't Strider 2 that came out on the home computers and Mega Drive. That was a US Gold game. It's not that great. Dungeon Master 2. Mega CD. Not a game I remember ever seeing on sale. Now later on I've seen Dungeon Master games and Dune and more adventure style games come out in PAL territories. You see them on eBay, but I don't really remember seeing them in shops. It must have been a pretty limited run. But I think that's the thing with the Mega CD. This is where it was good at. So it wasn't using too much video. It was trying to convert a lot of games that came out on the Amiga and the ST that used a lot of floppy disks and condense them onto a CD-ROM. And that works, and I think that's that's a good use of the CD format. This looks so much like the interface to Captive. I think it was probably by the same manufacturer. Might not. Shiny, yeah, Earthworm Jim. Dave Perry did some really, really nice looking games on the platform. And the Mega Drive and the SNES, really. And I think it's nice to see that this is getting the coverage and a bit of hype, even when the new machines are just around the corner. Not everyone likes Earthworm Jim. It plays a little bit odd, but when you compare it to platformer games from the first few years of the Mega Drive's life, it's a massive improvement over the way they just use the hardware. The artwork really does make good use of the limited colour palette on the Mega Drive, which is only 16 colours per layer, and then you've got another 2 that you can then bring up to 64 colours, but that's not that much if you're doing very high quality artwork. So it shows how games like this and Sonic 3 really did make a good use of the hardware. But Aladdin was the other one that came out by then, and that was a nice looking game. I had it at the time. I found it a little bit repetitive, but it looked nice. Yeah, Earthworm Jim will contain such delights as screen rotation, diagonal scrolling, and circular scrolling. I don't remember there being any rotation in this. I'm talking about huge rotation in the background. You can kind of cheat on the Mega Drive because you can scroll tile map up on certain columns and down certain columns. And you can scroll horizontally by scan line, so you can kind of rotate almost 45 degrees. So I had to play around with that a few months ago, just as a bit of homebrew. You can kind of get that effect. It's like the Batman and Robin game, but you can't do proper rotation on it really without doing it all on the CPU, which doesn't really have the grunt for, sadly. 3DO. Yeah, there's a lot of competition. Do you really think there'll be room for yourselves as well as Sega, Sony and Nintendo? Not really. Yeah, the idea for the 3DO was great, that you've got a single platform and multiple manufacturers will make hardware and software for. But if I recall, the problem with the 3DO was that they didn't really make much money, or if any money, off the software. It was all on the hardware, so the price was so high, because Sony and Nintendo and Sega would typically sell the hardware at a bit of a loss, but make money back on the licensing, but it didn't really work with the 3DO. Yeah, the next thing that was being promoted was the M2, but that never really came out. I think it ended up in some arcade hardware. It was an add-on to the 3DO really, to give it better texture mapping and probably more memory, better CPU. But I think for the price of the machine, there's not really much of an incentive. Sky's the limit. Yes, it's 3D rendering, which is becoming more and more popular at this point. So you're doing your FMV and your pre-rendered backgrounds, and even sprite work was starting to be done in 3D with games like Donkey Kong and Sonic 3 to an extent. But yeah, it's less pixel art at this point and more proper 3D artistry. Out of sync. So they're talking about here the differences in the world with different machines. So the problem you've got is you've got NTSC in Japan and the US, and you've got PAL and CCAM in Europe and Australia. And PAL has more lines on the screen, so it has a high resolution, but it has 50 Hertz, so it's 50 frames a second, whereas NTSC has 60 frames a second, but fewer lines on the screen. And it's really bad for us in Europe, because what happens is you get a game and it doesn't use all the lines on the screen, so it looks squashed and it doesn't run at full speed, which isn't great. Now, a lot of Amiga games, for example, were made for PAL and didn't really look right in the US, so I suppose it does work the other way. but it's just the nature of these machines. We don't really have that now because you've got your HD TVs that are all designed to work at 60 hertz really. So all your games are 60 hertz, not 50. So it's kind of gone away. But you can modify consoles. Like you can modify your Mega Drive and your SNES to be 60 hertz and put a switch in there. But I think the other thing at the time, they were talking about CD formats because cartridges physically didn't fit into different consoles. And we'd already had this with home computers with tape and floppy disks that, yes, the media physically fit, but the hardware was totally different. You've got a different CPU and the games just don't run. And I think now people are more familiar with that. That even with the PS4 and the Xbox One are pretty similar, but you can't play games from one and the other. It's just the way it is. But I think they're asking the question about, are things going to change? That's interesting. Just noticed that. Until manufacturers support 60Hz TV in the UK, it's likely that UKers will get a good deal with the US and the Japanese. Now, mid-90s they did. A lot of TVs that came out, as long as you had a SCART input and you weren't running off RF, you could output 60 Hz. And even the Dreamcast was one of the first machines that gave you the option that if you had one of these TVs, the game would output in 60 Hz. And that was brilliant because they played just like the Japanese versions. Unless you imported one, that got a bit odd because you had to have a special boot that forced the machine into that mode because you weren't going to get that menu on an input. But that was the start of it, and the GameCube started to do similar things in the PS2. SOS, I haven't heard of this one, but looking at this, because everything's at an angle, it looks like it's a Mode 7 style game. So it's nice to see innovative uses of Mode 7, but I like the idea that you've got this background that's rotating and you're having to grab onto ledges while they're spinning around. These cards look a little bit like Zero Tolerance. Don't know if it's the same developer. It says Victor Kai is the publisher, Human is the developer. Don't recall Human. Yeah, more of it. What's this an advert for? The Future Sound of London. Don't really know much about that. Probably electronic music. Win a CD32 and the MPEG card. Well, that's pretty good. They're quite desirable for playing your video CDs. Corridor 7, yeah, that's a game that I think was a little bit too little too late. Now, I do like the game, but I think it was based on the Wolfenstein engine, and at this point Doom had been out a while and Quake was around the corner, or maybe a year or so away. But it was seen as a bit dated. I like this because it's kind of like System Shock. Sometimes having a bit of a more crude visual style adds a bit more to the atmosphere and makes you use your imagination. Pacific Strike. Yeah, this is definitely one of those DOS games. There's a certain visual style to it and I really like it. These look like your artwork looks so much like Wing Commander. But yeah, these games look pretty good for the time. You would have had to have had a pretty expensive PC. But yeah, so they're saying 7 megabytes of disk space, which I suppose on a hard disk at that point, you might have had a 100 meg, 200 meg if you were lucky hard disk. Yeah, they eat up space. I remember installing lots of game demos from magazine CDs because you used to get magazines like PC Gamer and they'd come with a CD and you get so much stuff on there, and it was great because you could just keep using these demo discs to get a really good feel of what these games were like and which ones were worth buying and which ones weren't. And particularly with shareware, you got quite a lot on these demos, but you'd fill the hard disk. That was the problem. That's a good game. Wario Land. Actually, all of these are really good games. H&V. Yep, still going today. Just about. It was a bit rocky a few years ago, but I think it's good to have shops on the high street that are selling physical media. I hate for everything to go completely digital, or you have to buy everything from online retailers. It's nice just to be able to see things sometimes. Super Wing Commander on the 3DO. I really want to play this at some point because it looks like it's an upgrade from the PC original, because we'd had ports to the SNES Mega CD, which again I don't think came out here, and the Amiga, but they weren't really designed for scaling and rotating lots and lots of sprites. I think the SNES got away with it, probably used Mode 7 in like a few places, but it could only really do one background, so I'm not sure how that worked, but this looks like a major upgrade. The cockpit looks quite different as well. But what did they think? 7 out of 10. So what was wrong? So it's saying, so far most 3DO software has been completely unworthy of attention. Happily, Super Wing Commander avoids falling into the same category. So Edge at this point are starting to say that the 3DO, despite being a promising machine, didn't really get the software support that it needed. Yeah, okay, so they're saying here that the graphic improvement is just, it's smoother than the original game, which sounds pretty good to me, because when you're dogfighting in space and everything's moving pretty fast, you want a decent frame rate. So that's good. Speaking of frame rate, Heavenly Symphony. This is F1 Beyond the Limit in the US. Didn't come out in the UK. I covered this a couple of years ago on my channel, and it's a really ambitious game because the SNES can't do sprite scaling. There's a big myth that it can. It can't. Not in hardware. It can do Mode 7, which is one background, which is essentially your track, but all your sprites on it have to be done using different size sprites that are held in the cartridge. So that's why games like Jaguar XJ220 and Batman Returns on the Mega CD look really good, because they had these Mode 7 style backgrounds, but the sprites properly scaled, and that was impressive. I mean, you had games like Road Rash that did bits and pieces in software, but the Mega CD had it all. The problem was that frame rate wasn't great. That's partially because of the way that the Mega CD and the Mega Drive interacted with each other. You're kind of drawing onto a what the Mega Drive has called a VDP, which is the video processor, and you're really drawing onto a tile map. So the Mega CD is generating this bitmap for its graphics, and then that's writing it into the Mega Drive's tile map, which the Mega Drive then displays on screen, just like a normal 2D game. And that's why you've got problems with the colour depth on videos, which is a little bit limited. So this game is quite impressive because you've got your Mode 7 style tracks and you've got all the sprite scaling, but it just runs at a really slow frame rate, which is a real shame. And yeah, I mean, you're looking at around 10-15 frames a second, which for a racing game really isn't enough. It's saying here, the game starts to lose its polish, and it's saying that games like Sonic CD, Soulstar, Thunderhawk were pretty quick, but here they're saying everything's blocky and a bit jerky and a bit nasty, so it got 4 out of 10, which is a shame really. So I don't know if it was just a bit too ambitious for the hardware. Seventh Guest CDI, yeah, that's a game that you'd associate with this era. I haven't played it. I remember seeing this game shown lots and lots and lots, because it was really the poster boy for the CD-ROM technology, and they're saying here like the PC version has full 24-bit colour. If you had a really expensive PC with a decent CD-ROM drive on the PC, this looked really, really nice. But they're saying here that the CDI version doesn't look quite as good. Now, it says here it does use the MPEG video card. So what used to happen was, for video on the Amiga and the Mega CD and 3DO, I think 3DO had this, but definitely the Saturn, the video had to be decoded by the main CPU, which was limited. But if you had hardware which did video decoding, like the PlayStation 1, I think had something in there to help with it. But with the Saturn and the CD32, I just mentioned it earlier on, and the CDI, you could get an MPEG cartridge that fitted in the back that did MPEG decoding. So MPEG is the video format that's used in video CD, and then MPEG-2 is DVD a few years later. But that was the way to go at the time. And if you could offload all that to a cartridge, you could have really nice quality video on it. But I'm just surprised here, they're saying that they are using this MPEG card, but it doesn't look as good as it can do. It's a little disappointing, really. Yeah, they're talking about game videos. Yeah, that's what it is, isn't it? I think, to be fair, we knock these games quite badly, the FMV games, but I think in years to come, game developers worked out how to better integrate the two together. So the PlayStation had a lot of FMV, but that was really for intros. And games like Tomb Raider used it quite a lot, but it wasn't really for gameplay, it was to tell the story. And I think it just got better and better as things went on. Yeah, so these are your converters for playing NTSC games on PAL systems. It's a lot of money, isn't it? So you got like that one in particular, that will do everything for 400 quid. But I suppose if you got the confidence to modify the system, you could do it, but then people didn't have the internet at home. It's difficult to get the instructions. And even like the Mega Drive, there's quite a few variants of it, and the mods are a little bit different. But I mean, you could send your machine off, it would just get expensive. So maybe one of these machines is better. Windjammers. Neo Geo game. Haven't played it, but I like the look of it. It looks quite... Well, Neo Geo, or SNK style. Games like this and Samurai Showdown, Metal Slug and all the others, they had a certain style that I really like. So Jaguar, USA SCART machine. Back to the 60 Hz. 300 quid import. So that would come down. The Jaguar machines are all American machines. There isn't really such a thing as a PAL machine. And it's the same with the games, because they all have the USA rating system on them. When they brought them out in Europe, they were just modified to run at PAL. But essentially, they're all American systems. Mine still runs on PAL. I've got a SCART lead for it, and I've never modified it because I don't have the confidence that I don't want to wreck the machine. Whereas with the Mega Drive, they're a little bit more common. So if you break it, it's not quite as expensive mistake. But yeah, Flying Shark. This is the arcade game, isn't it? I'm thinking Fire Shark, which was a Mega Drive conversion, but I wonder if this is some kind of sequel. Don't know. I like the look of it. Looks quite traditional, but the colour depth's pretty good. PC Engine. Oh, that's a handheld at £180. Turbo Duo 325. Yeah, that's pretty much what you'd pay now to import one. Yeah, that's naughty. 16 meg of RAM. This is something that used to happen at the time. There's a difference between megabyte and megabit, and they used to do this with modem speeds, and they used to do this with cartridges. There's 8 bits in a byte, so when it says 16 meg, it really means 16 megabit, which is 2 megabytes. So with your Amiga, if you've got 1 megabyte Amiga, it's 1 megabyte, which is 8 megabit. So here they're saying 16 meg. If you had 16 megabytes on a PC, that would be really expensive, but it's not. It's 2, which is more like the Saturn and the PlayStation, really. But I mean, they're saying 17-button controller, RGB output, 24-bit graphics, 16 million colours, better than CD quality sound. That's probably. The Jaguar used sampling just like the Amiga, really. I don't know where that comes from, better than CD quality sound, unless it can do like 48 kilohertz rather than 44, but it's not really better than CD quality sound. This is a machine to give Sega and Nintendo a run for their money. Features include 3 processors, 64-bit RISC processor, 34-bit RISC chip, with built-in DSP and 16 megahertz, 68,000 Motorola CPU. 34-bit. I think that's a typo. Yeah, we know the story. I'm just being silly here. The Jaguar really had these 2 Tom and Jerry chips that Atari marketed as being a 64-bit system. Whether it is or it isn't is a up to debate, because the Jaguar Tom and Jerry chips have got like 64-bit bus access. So is it 64? Is it 16? I don't know. The Dreamcast SH4 in some ways has got 16-bit instructions. So does that mean it's a 16-bit CPU? But it's got 128-bit vector unit. So is it 128? Who knows? Who cares? Superplay. A good magazine. There's a podcast called Maximum Power Up that did a really good show about a month ago, maybe a little bit more, covering the history of this magazine, and there's a load of interviews with people that worked on it, and it's about 2 hours long. It's really worth checking out. But again, lots of good YouTube videos by Cajonos Deloro, who was looking at Superplay about a year ago. Really nice run of those issues. Charts. They've gone to a more standard layout now. FIFA's still dominating, so we're still on the first one at that time. Sonic the Hedgehog 3, 60 quid. Yeah. I think they did that because they could. Aladdin. Yeah, Sensible Soccer. Some Amiga conversions here. But, these are games I think that have stuck around. Yeah. Chaos Engine, Sensible Soccer, Brutal Sports, that was on the Jaguar, Alien Breed, Project X, Nick Faldo's Golf. Never played that one. That was meant to be pretty good. Mega CD Ground Zero Texas. I do like that. It's bad. It's bad B movie, but with it being an FMV game, it kind of works. Night Trap, never really got into that. Lethal Enforcers, Thunderhawk, yeah. So I think really the Mega CD, you've either got 3 types of games. You've got the games that do the Mode 7 style, which Core Design did some really nice titles. You've got FMV games, or you've got games that really just treated the CD unit as a big cartridge, like the Dungeon Master games, for example. And that's not a bad thing. The Mega CD's got the reputation it has. Japan, Final Fantasy VI, Super Puyo Puyo, Derby Stallion. There's a lot of horse games on the Super Famicom. It's worth having a look. It's a little bit different than what you get in the West. Sailor Moon, another anime, Super Metroid. Had that come out over here? It wasn't in the charts, so yeah, we might still be waiting for that one. Muscle Bomber, Fatal Fury 2, Dragon Ball Z 3, Virtua Racing, and Fire Emblem. Yeah, a little bit different flavour than what you get in the West. Rare. I'm getting towards the end now. Rare designs on the future. So what are they after? Is that a D or an O? 30 modelers. I wonder if that means 3D modelers. Game designers. 3D modelling. Now, Donkey Kong was coming out. So you can see why the 3D was a big deal for them. Yeah, so they're using Unix C, etc., etc. No Unity at this point. And yeah, so they're talking about Nintendo's new machine. So they're really gearing up for developing for the N64. So you've got games like GoldenEye, which were really, really innovative at the time. Iguana, I think they were a 3DO developer. Virtual Reality Pro. Oh, what's this? Oh, it's Virtuality. It's those arcade machines. I thought they'd gone bust at this point because they came out, I remember, about 92, and you see them occasionally at play, but they seem to come and go pretty quickly. There weren't that many games, so I'm surprised in 94 they're still advertising, so I've no idea what these guys were doing at the time. Or maybe they went into high-end arcades or like some kind of amusement parks or something. Don't know. PSX development is the PlayStation. So yeah, lots of wonderful things by Psygnosis over the years. They're a really nice developer. There's a video by Kim Justice who covered the history of Psygnosis, and there's quite a lot in there about the PlayStation era. Yeah, graphics development. Leisure Company Northwest. Don't know what that is. Must be Manchester area, I'd assume. 68K 6502C Apple Mac. So that's your classic Macs. Sometimes interesting to look at these, and you can kind of work out what games were being made and what these are for. Jeff Minter. Yeah, Jeff was at Play Again this year with the PS4 VR and a new game on that really looks good. I think his games, the aesthetic hasn't changed, and that's nice because you know what you're getting with Jeff Minter games. But yeah, nice to see the interview here, because I would say at this point, had he moved to Atari, because he developed Tempest 2000 and then worked for Atari to do Defender 2000 and didn't like it, and then went back to being like an independent developer again. But yeah, really a legend for the UK games industry. I do like Jeff Minter games. Perhaps they don't have the huge amount of replayability. The simple games that you've got to master, like arcade games, but I think once you've mastered them, they kind of get a little bit samey in a way, and they just get harder. Yeah, so they're talking about the Jaguar. That's interesting. It says the other reason I love the Jaguar, that it's easy to program for. If you program this to your Amiga, you can go into the Jaguar straight away. Yeah, it's all laid out logically. You don't have to write any arcane DSP language. Now, this is kind of naughty for the Jaguar, because the Jaguar had these 64-bit Tom and Jerry CPUs, but it had a 68K that was meant to be used as a controller. But what ended up happening was, because the 68K is what the Mega Drive uses, the Amiga uses, the ST uses, it was really easy to port games to it, but essentially you've got the same hardware as the 16-bit consoles, which was good and bad. So it meant it was really easy to port games to the machine, but if you weren't familiar with these DSP chips that were in there, you couldn't really take advantage of the hardware, and that's what happened, sadly. But Tempest 2000 was a good game, and I think Jeff Minter used the 68K for the gameplay and then pushed bits of graphics onto the other chips, which is perhaps the best way of doing it. Because it wasn't visually amazing, but it looked pretty solid at the time, and it played really well. Yeah, talking about CD32 ports of PC games, which the PC at this point was just light years ahead of the Amiga. Commodore was not in a good place, and they just never really caught up. I mean, you had your accelerator cards, but I think at this point PCs were just becoming so much more common. Yeah, it's saying here, Sega's Mars upgrade should give the Mega Drive near arcade standard virtual reality performance. It's not quite up there with the arcade version, but it's pretty good. So they're saying the standard Mega Drive can handle nowhere near... Yeah, so they're saying 4,500 polygons per second. Needs the SVP chip to do that number. Yeah, so they're speculating about the hardware on the Saturn as well. Super Stardust, that's a nice looking game. And that's it. So next month the CDI, which, yeah, was pretty much dead, I would say, at this point. I remember seeing it, and I remember seeing lots of video CDs for it, but not many games. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I think I've got the next issue. It gets a bit patchy in certain years. I've got missing issues, but it'll be interesting to see what they say about this, whether it's all about a bright future or whether it's really talking about the beginning of the end, which sadly it was the beginning of the end. So yeah, so it's been a little while coming. It's been a few months, but we're back with hopefully a bit more of a regular schedule. So I've got some more issues of Edge over the next couple of years, so it'll be nice just to keep going on with this and see what happened with history just over 22 years ago. So yeah, thanks for watching.